Okay, my name is Judy Brewer. I want to welcome you all to this webinar on strengthening disability inclusive technology policymaking. And thank you so much for your interest in this topic. And I want to just mention a few accessibility things up front. We have ASL interpreting. We also have court reporting. If you need, you can turn on the captions. It's usually at the bottom of your screen there. And we also will be taking questions during the webinar, and we will get to those if we can towards the end of the webinar. I think there's also an option to upvote questions that you're interested in or want to support. I also want to note that we are recording the session. So I believe that there may be some students and research assistants who have just joined um, an in-person room to be viewing the webinar, and I'm hoping that they are getting settled in. Sorry to keep you all waiting for a few minutes, but I'm going to assume that they're settled down. We're doing a semi-hybrid mode here. And it's just really a great pleasure to be able to welcome you to this topic. I think it's a very important conversation. Um, and this is hosted by the School of Information and the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. And I owe my deep thanks to Deirdre Mulligan, who created UC Berkeley's Executive Fellowship in Applied Technology Policy, and to Dan Jukoff, who keeps us organized, and Vivian, who is helping with today's session. And I'm also going to thank upfront my two research assistants who have been helping with my research and writing, Jana Sharifolina and Kayona Leah Martinson. And they've helped me make sense of the job that I was doing for 2 years. So before I talk about what motivated me to try to pull together this webinar, I'm honored to be joined today by three awesome colleagues who are doing important work on disability inclusive technology to talk together about pathways to technology policymaking and upcoming policy needs and opportunities. So let me start by introducing them, and then I will give brief context on the topic of the webinar, and then I'll pass it back to them one by one to say a little bit more about their work, particularly as it relates to disability inclusive policymaking. Marcy Roth is the CEO of the World Institute on Disability, advancing the rights of 1.3 billion people with disabilities worldwide. She brings over 4 decades of leadership in global human rights, accessibility, and inclusion, focusing on sustainable development, disaster risk reduction, early warnings, humanitarian action, climate justice, and community resilience, and was appointed by President Obama to DHS FEMA and served from 2009 to 2017, and is listed in Forbes magazine's 50 over 50 impact and 2025 accessibility 100 lists. So you'll be hearing from Marcy today. You'll also be hearing from Bonnie Sweener um, with both a doctorate and a Master of Public Health. She's the endowed professor of disability health and justice at Johns Hopkins University and the founding director of the Johns Hopkins Disability Health Research Center, which aims to shift the paradigm from living with a disability to thriving with a disability, which I love, by the way. Um, and her work bridges disability policy and the ethical application of emerging technologies to advance data equity and accessibility. Drawing on her lived experience, she also works to improve disability inclusion in STEM careers. We also have today Raja Kushalnagar, who is a deaf professor with over 20 years of research experience in accessible computing. He's the director of the um, Bachelor of Science in Information Tech and the Master's in Science in Accessible Human-Centered Computing Programs and Artificial Intelligence Accessibility and Sign Language Center at Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. He has a doctorate in computer science, an LLM in intellectual property and information law from the University of Houston, and a JD from Texas Southern University. So awesome panel today. Um, Let me share just some quick context on the topic of this webinar, and then we'll go back to our panelists to hear more about the work they're doing, and then we'll go into discussion. So for years, I worked on accessibility standards for web and mobile as director of the Web Accessibility Initiative at the World Wide Web Consortium, which was headquartered at the time at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab. There was always an element of policy discussion on the side of the technical standards development. Um, Governments were interested in using our consensus-based accessibility standards to ensure that everyone can use the web, that people aren't left out accidentally because the standard wasn't built right to support accessible things. So accessibility and disability inclusion are part of W3C's culture and part of its value proposition in the standards world. So that's the environment I was used to working in. I then got an invitation to work on accessibility at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, or OSTP for short, at the White House during 2023 and 2024. I'm not there now. This provided an opportunity to help bring disability rights into the digital age in many areas of national tech policy. And OSTP had the opportunity to help different federal agencies clarify accessibility for state and local level, to improve digital accessibility with more implementation support at the federal level, to, for instance, explore more efficient production of accessible science and technology publications. Those are the kinds of things we were working on. What was curious to me, though, was I had wonderful colleagues, but over and over, I would find that they'd had no exposure to even basic that some of them had, particularly if they had disability in their family or themselves, but a lot of people had had no exposure to even basic concepts on disability aspects of mainstream technology policy needs or disability demographics, or some of them thought we were about 2 to 3% of the population, which startled me because that's not quite the case. It's more than that. Or they didn't have the background on disability rights. So given the fast pace, we'd often miss opportunities to collaborate on policy work because everything was just rushing by. So then with the help of my research assistants, in 2025, since I've been in this executive fellowship at UC Berkeley, we've started looking at the curriculum of schools of public policy. I think only maybe 2 out of the top 20 schools of public policy have something in their core curriculum or specialized courses. So students aren't getting exposure to some basics of what the public in this country needs to better serve, to improve things. And then with think tanks, only about a third of the most influential think tanks seem to have projects or research related to disability. And that's actually changing. I've seen some great stuff in the past few weeks coming along, so I'm encouraged. But it started to look like policymakers and think tank folks weren't getting the basics. Uh, I've been writing and reflecting for many months now on what we accomplished there, what new resources and approaches might help technology policy needs and opportunities in the future. Still have more writing to do. Um, and I just want to say, this may be a challenging time for many of us, as so many programs and services that people with disabilities depend on for education, employment, healthcare, and more are being dismantled. But even as we defend and, help explain the need for the existing programs and services, it's important to think about the future. So before I switch this back over to Marcy, first, I want to just remind people, in case you joined a few minutes late, we have ASL throughout the meeting. If you need captions, you can turn those on at the bottom of the screen. And if there's any technical interrupt, we'll take a minute or two to try to sort things out, and then we may rejoin and so forth. But we're being recorded. Look at the questions or add to those if you want. So let's hear more from our panelists. Marcy, could you please tell us more, and either Vivian or Dan, if you can just put her solo on screen for a moment, but with the ASL interpreter still. Can you tell us more about your work at the World Institute on Disability, particularly as it relates to disability inclusive policymaking? Just for a few minutes, if you could, please.
Sure. Thank you, Judy, and hi, everybody. This is Marcy speaking. It is a pleasure to be with you all. The World Institute on Disability was founded by Judy Heumann, Ed Roberts, and Joan Leon in Berkeley, California in 1983, founded as a think tank and research and policy shop with a focus on the rights of what are now identified as 1.3 billion people with disabilities worldwide. We work with folks in over 130 countries, and everything we do has a very hard nexus with technology, whether it's the actual development of products, whether it's in providing disability expertise in developing policies and processes, or whether it's very simply in helping to advance laws and policies that support the rights and opportunities of people with disabilities. And our work is always led by people with disabilities, and our priorities are in accessibility and inclusion, and most especially the leadership of people with disabilities. Glad to be here.
Thank you, Marcy. And Raja, could you tell us some about the different things you're doing at Gallaudet? I know there's a lot of different things there, but particularly if there are pieces that are related to the tech policy angle.
Certainly. Hi, everyone. I am Raja Kushalnagar. And now I don't actually know how to pronounce my last name correctly, and neither does the interpreter, but that's all right, because of course there's more than one way to access language, and whatever way you do it, whether it be through spoken language, written, or signed, we can see we're all here to do that. And one aspect of access that I really want to spotlight here today is around language access. And I am a professor at Gallaudet University, which is a university for deaf and hard of hearing students. We are a bilingual university in both American Sign Language and written English, visual access to both of those. And it's quite a unique university. We also operate a center for research on accessibility and sign language and AI. Of course, AI is changing the landscape quite a bit and changing access from people providing it to people receiving it, which of course brings up many new topics for discussion and reflecting on. Yeah, I'll stop there. Oh, let me also add, I also mentor and engage our students in an effort to uplift people with disabilities. And encourage them to enter the pipeline from high school to college, PhD studies, and beyond.
I have mentored over 130 students.
And I also have research interns as part of our work, where we have individuals become part of developing technology. We like to repeat the phrase, nothing about us without us. We want to have every aspect of research and development be engaging with individuals with disabilities. And I know we will also be reframing that discussion later as well.
Thanks so much, Raja. Bonnie, you're doing a ton of things at Johns Hopkins. Can you give us an overview of your work, including as it relates to tech policy?
Yeah, sure. This is Bonnie, and first off, I'm so grateful for this conversation, and as Marcy said, just really grateful to be here. So thanks so much to you, Judy. So I founded the Disability Health Research Center at Johns Hopkins in 2019 as a labor of love. It took many years to get moving, but finally did. And our mission, as Judy mentioned, is to shift the paradigm from living with a disability to thriving with a disability. And we're really focused on using data, research, education, and policy to do just that. Our specific goals are to advance data equity and technology innovation in ways that empower people with disabilities, and to address the inequities impacting disabled people in actionable ways, not just to find them, but to do something about them. And we work across sectors in that area, from healthcare to education to employment to technology. We're also really invested in strengthening the science and technology, the STEM, STEM ecosystem, and are working to make it more accessible and more inclusive for people with disabilities, and to make sure that there's more opportunities for people with disabilities to not just be a part of that ecosystem, but to be successful and to be leaders. And then last but certainly not least, probably most important, is we partner with the disability community in everything we do. We're really driven to both develop and use approaches and methods that ensure disabled people aren't just part of the work, but are leading the work.
Thank you, Bonnie. And those are all important themes that I want to be following up on in this discussion. So thanks, Marcy and Raja and Bonnie, for sharing some initial background there. I want to look at some of the pathways to tech policy making. And I know that that's sometimes a challenging situation in systems that don't necessarily expect us to be at the table. So I want to start with a question that I know is awkward, but I'm going to ask it, Bonnie, a question of you, and I'll say I've been there when I applied for my biotech associate liberal arts master thing or whatever. The initial response was, "Oh, you're not the kind of student we're looking for. No, we're not going to admit you to the program." And then we had some follow-up discussions. But you're an internationally recognized scientist leading an important health center at Johns Hopkins. You've told me that you encountered some barriers in your academic preparation. What did you encounter, and what were they missing in that? What did they not understand about your potential career path?
Yeah, well, this is Bonnie. Such a good question. And I think so many of us have really important stories to tell about this. For me, I began losing my vision when I was 25. So that was the start of my disability journey. And it was, just weeks or months after I had sent out applications to grad school. And I have vision loss. And in the beginning, it was pretty rapid and changed a lot of things about my life. I'd really dreamed of being a scientist since I was a kid. But after my vision loss began, I was told over and over again, Judy, like you're referring to, that I just had to let that dream go.
Yeah.
That a blind person couldn't be a researcher, couldn't be a scientist. And I'll be honest, I bought into it at first because I didn't know anyone else like me who was a scientist or a researcher. Obviously, that, wasn't the case in the end. But that wasn't the only hurdle. Just getting into grad school and getting through grad school was not where it ended. All across my career, there's been so many moments where I was excluded from projects, and
Mhm.
times when people were open that the reason I was not being included was because they were worried I couldn't do the work. I couldn't handle it because of my disability. And they really questioned my ability to analyze data, to stay on top of the scientific literature. And what's always been so striking to me about those experiences is that the focus was always on my perceived limitation
Hmm.
instead of the inaccessibility of the systems and the technology
Yeah.
that we use in science. And that mindset still persists today. It's
Mhm.
been too often that the expectation is that I alone or someone with a disability alone should find these accessibility solutions, should take down these barriers ourselves. But accessibility is not a personal problem to be solved, as we know, right? It's a collective responsibility, and making our technology and our data and our research environments inclusive really benefit everyone. We're still on this road. We're still having these conversations, but I really am glad we are.
It's a long road, and thank you so much for, doing your piece to push through all that and to create a program that a lot of other people have seen now. Um, Marcy, I want to ask you, because I know you went to one of the elite schools of public policy in the country. And again, some of the research I was doing with these wonderful research assistants was finding, wow, they're introducing a lot of other topics, but not disability. Very, very few of them. What was your experience in that setting? Were they teaching the entire batch of students about this large part of the what's our percent of the population? Were they teaching that? And then what was it like as your experience going through that with the disability?
Yeah, yeah. So this is Marcy speaking. And, first of all, the CDC has said that we are 28.7% of the US population, not an insignificant number. And
So from the Center for Disability, yeah, okay.
Centers for
So it's
Disease
disease control,
Control and
right? Yeah,
Prevention.
okay. CDC,
So,
yep.
yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So, my time at the Harvard Kennedy School was fascinating in ever so many ways.
Hmm.
And I was an anomaly, as is often the case. Probably many people with disabilities in the room, but absolutely not identifying. And
Mm.
When I was at Kennedy School, I was not yet using a mobility device on a regular basis. So, people weren't necessarily seeing me as disabled. And as is often the case, it becomes my responsibility to, raise the issues of disability expertise, disability accessibility, the imperatives for research that is explicitly inclusive of us. And, I spent most of my time there, as I have in many other locations, including in the federal government, trying to consistently convince people that disability policy is
Hmm.
not a nice to have. It's not an add-on. It's not, a little something, something special. It is, in fact, at the heart of what we need to drive real change. And then certainly when we're talking about technology innovation, most of the time I was hearing, sort of the reactions like, oh, you're so inspirational. this is so interesting. I've never thought of this before. This is at Harvard. I mean, you know, it is hard to imagine that, you know, and I've been at this a very, very long time, as I know you have too, Judy. You know, for all of the years upon years of work that we have been doing, people are still like, oh, I hadn't really thought of that. Or, wow, Marcy, I'm so glad you're here.
Okay, so later in the discussion, I want to come back to some ideas on what schools of public policy could do, including
Yes.
like free curriculum that's out there that they could add
Yes.
as supplement. But Raja, I want to ask you, I still remember the very first conversation we had, which I think went on nonstop for quite a while after you and I had been in a seminar all day together. And you sounded so passionate to me about teaching students at Gallaudet and mentoring them, particularly in exploring, you know, the cutting edge technologies, the emerging technologies. And I was so happy because most of the people I was talking with, they were working on web, they were working on mobile, but there were very few people working on emerging technology accessibility. So what I'm curious about is how do you try to prepare the students you work with to mentor them to be able to go into a tech landscape that's so heavily informed by policy issues in many cases, particularly with some of the emerging technologies. And I'm also curious how you got through 2 law degrees and a doctorate in computer science with, you know, accessibility considerations, but you did. So just jump in where you want then.
Unfortunately, I missed the question somewhat.
Sure, no worries. And let me just double check. I know Jennifer, you're voicing in the background there. Let me double check on this. Raja, I was mentioning the very first conversation that we had was at the end of a long workshop we'd been in for like a day and a half or something. And we started talking about accessibility of emerging technologies. What came through to me was how passionate you were about teaching and mentoring students at Gallaudet. You know, you were doing these research projects with them over the summer, and you were working on cutting edge technologies that a lot of other people had not yet been looking at with regard to accessibility. So I'm curious, like, how you try to prepare those students for working in the tech landscape when there's a lot of policy context that informs that. I'm also curious how you got through 2 law degrees and a doctorate in computer science. Like, did you get the communication accommodations you need? You know, so jump in anywhere on that you'd like. And did that come through better this time?
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Yes, thank you for that. So I would say first off, I want to emphasize that people with disabilities have been here through all time and all cultures. Um, when it comes to inclusive communication or expectations, those are sometimes where the challenges lie. And that also is true in statistics. In elementary school, there tends to be a larger number of those who are identified, and then those students, as they age throughout the school system, we see the numbers drop off, and that is
Yeah.
not necessarily an accurate reflection. We see about 1% of students with disabilities represented in PhD students. And I would say that's actually quite also due to barriers and my personal experience with barriers to education. also has encouraged me to look at technology and how we are not using inclusive design and therefore excluding people. And often people don't understand or aren't even aware of policies that affect individuals with disabilities. Texas had some motivation. I had some motivation for grad school in Texas. I entered a PhD program and found quite a lot of frustration with my accessibility services. So I went to law school to get that policy information for myself so I could learn how to access my own rights. Unfortunately, that didn't necessarily pave the way smoothly for me, but what it did do was increase my understanding of the policy implications and existing laws, so that I was able to better inform and the development of technology in the field. And I would say now creating a graduate program, firstly for accessible technology, instructional technology. I don't believe those things can be separated. I don't think we can disentangle these things. We need to work on them all together. So we call our program Accessible Human-Centered Computing and Policy. And I find it very effective in that regard. Students either go into technical design, advising, consulting work, or into policy consulting work for use of technology in accessible manners. So these two things work very well together in terms of feeding each other with generating ideas together. And in terms of my involvement in the world of people with and without disabilities, I see us all working together to increase understanding of what we can do to become really big allies in this field upon graduation from our program. Those who do or do not have disabilities really need to work together on seeing both sides of the challenges.
Thanks, and thanks for sharing more of that background, because I don't think you and I had ever talked about that part of how you got to where you are in the incredible emerging technology work that you're doing at Gallaudet. So I want to take another angle now. There were a lot of policy advances during the Biden-Harris administration. And a significant one for people with disabilities. I'm not going to recap all the other work that was going on, but it was an evidence agenda for disability data, and a colleague of mine, Adam Politis, led a lot of the work on that. But there was an entire community that was working to make sure that happened, because we hadn't had a good evidence agenda on disability. Bonnie, I want to come to a question for you, and then I'll go to Marcy. And then I will be going to some emerging tech things after that. And Raja, let me know if we should swap at that point on ASL when I'm asking you the question again, because I know you've worked with Jennifer directly there. But Bonnie, thank you for the work you have done to promote the importance of disability data. Can you tell me why you think good data is so important to policymaking? And should we be having concerns now about loss of public data? And if so, what can we do about that? Could better data on STEM, on access to science, technology, engineering, and math, help us learn how to make those fields more accessible? And then just to throw one other thing in there, I saw a really fun thing this morning about dearly departed data sets. And I'm curious what you think about that messaging to help people understand why data matters.
Yeah, this is Bonnie. Thanks so much, Judy. As I think you know, talking about disability data is like my pastime. So I appreciate this question. Yeah, so first off, data is essential. It's a foundation for policy making. Data is so much more than numbers and statistics in that area. It's how we understand our country, our communities. Good data accurately reflects who we are, where inequities exist, and helps us effectively, efficiently allocate resources. For people with disabilities, data really is essential to understanding the barriers that hold us back from thriving, right? That's the goal that we're working towards. But it's equally important to understand that data are not neutral. Data have power, and those who control the data can bend that power. So that's why I am deeply concerned about data at this moment, about what's happening to our federal data systems. We're seeing these unprecedented challenges, reductions in publicly available data, changes in how data are being collected, threats to funding that support our national data infrastructure, all are bending that power. And those shifts put at risk the ability of our policymakers, our researchers, and our advocates to make evidence-based and informed decisions and really take down opportunities to uphold accountability and drive change. So, you referenced the dearly departed data sets, and I'm so glad you did, because despite all of that doom and gloom I just stated, I am really heartened to know that there's a number of national efforts ongoing right now to prop up our national data systems. Denise Ross, who was the former U.S. Chief Data Scientist, I know is also a UC Berkeley Executive Fellow in the Applied Technology Policy Program. And I think, if I saw correctly, hosted a session just yesterday about data, no surprise.
Yeah.
But she's really this driving force behind so many national efforts to shore up the national data systems. And what she's been doing is trying to get more of the American population to understand the value of data, and not from a researcher angle. We've talked to each other and we've used jargon for far too long, but to really help everyone understand why data are necessary, and to take these conversations of data and make them easier to talk about in so many ways. But I do remain worried about disability data. Yeah. And there's a lot of work to do in that space.
Does the stuff that Denise is doing have a way that the public can contribute information to as well?
Yeah.
Am I recalling correctly on that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
A number of ways. I'm not sure.
Okay, great.
Uh,
I think different people are trying to circulate that in different settings, and I'm really glad that that's happening. I want to jump over to Marcy for another question that starts from data. One of the areas you've really pioneered at WID in terms of disability-led organizations is inclusive emergency preparedness and responsiveness. And I am starting to see more discussion on that field, but still not as much as we need, I think. And I have to say that when I was working at OSTP and helping a little bit with the creation of that federal evidence agenda on disability, one of the statistics that just blew people away was that the mortality for people with disabilities in some types of disasters is 4 times the mortality of people without disabilities. And it's just, it would get this reaction from people like, oh, maybe I better start paying attention to that. Maybe I can learn something from that. So can you just comment maybe briefly on, like, would better data on that help? Help us survive better, would help everybody plan better. And is this something that's maybe better understood on a global level now than in the US?
Yeah, thank you, Judy. This is Marcy speaking. So, I have a love-hate relationship with data. Mostly love, but a little bit of hate. And that's because sometimes those data are used to minimize the impact, the disparate impact on people with disabilities and, you know, the disparate numbers of people with disabilities. So, you know, for instance, uh, when people say, I had no idea that people with disabilities die at 4 times the rate of other people in disasters. Well, that's because those data are very difficult to come by. And when we try and count, we often, you know, garbage in, garbage out, we ask the wrong questions, and then we end up getting these really inaccurate low numbers that simply prove how wrong we are that this is actually a thing. You know, I first became involved in emergency preparedness, disaster risk reduction in the literally September 11th of 2001,
Right.
when I was asked by the I was working for the National Council on Independent Living, and I was asked by the White House to help them to figure out what to do about the unintended consequences of decisions that were being made in New York City that were blocking personal assistance service providers, blocking paratransit, sign language interpreting on screens, et cetera, et cetera. And even though I had been working in disability rights my whole life, I had never really thought about what happens for people with disabilities in disasters. So, you know, fast forward, that's become a really central part of the work that I do. And I feel very strongly that, you know, what happens to communities is really centered on how well we include the leadership of people with disabilities before, during, and after disasters. You know, that 4 times number comes from the Great East Japan earthquake in 2010. In Japan, they did a really excellent job, 2011. They did an excellent job of looking at those data, and those data are now used very regularly to identify that disproportionate impact of disasters on people with disabilities.
So the UN has a project that's I've heard you be pretty excited about, and I just give us a sentence or two about that, because I feel like more people
Yeah,
in this country need to be tracking that. And
yeah,
there's a tech piece as well, right?
yeah.
Accountable. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, you know, the UN the United Nations has for about the last 4 years been involved in an organization-wide disability inclusion strategy
Yeah.
that was led by, introduced by the UN Secretary General Guterres. And it is a very measurable process by which each of the 50 plus UN agencies are internally assessing their progress in key areas, key pillars, and areas of work in
Mhm.
making everything that the United Nations does accessible to all. And
Okay.
one specific area that I'm particularly excited about is the Secretary General has identified a global goal that every person on Earth, his words, not mine, will have access to early warnings by the end of 2027. And as ambitious as that goal is, I was very fortunate and honored to have been appointed to his advisory panel to focus very specifically on how we make sure that people
Mhm.
who need actionable alerts and warnings can get those along with everybody else. So the data may or may not give us the push that we need.
Okay.
Fortunately, on a global scale, we have a significant commitment from the United Nations to drive
Okay.
these kinds of technology advancements.
And if we get tech right, that can save lives. And
100%.
it probably makes it easier for everybody too. Okay, I could talk with you about that for hours. I'm so glad you're in that work. We probably need more people to get in that work as well. I want to come over to the biggest buzzword going around in technology right now. So Raja, I want to ask you a few questions in a row. I just want to do a check-in on ASL interpreting. Are we good? Okay, yep. So interrupt me if you need me to repeat something. One of the most pressing technology policy issues currently is AI, and there are so many different perspectives on this. Raja, your principal investigator for research on AI in this wonderful new project that you've landed at Gallaudet, are you looking at the promise of AI for people with disabilities or certain kinds of risks or both? Are you concerned about areas where there might be premature use of AI, even while it's interesting to be researching the possibilities down the road? So that's my first question.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'm excited to share that we have received a grant to provide training for advancing people on their graduate degrees around AI accessibility. And this is a very important question because what AI is doing is moving the locus of control from people who produce information to people who receive information or who use it in a variety of different ways. As an example, image descriptions for individuals who are blind or low vision. Before, individuals were responsible for creating those image descriptions. So blind users would receive the image and a human-generated description. And then there are many layers within that. The person who created the image may not always give an appropriate context because they are making a decision about what is included or excluded. For example, if there are 4 individuals standing in a photo, who are they? Are they all men or women? Do we know their names? What is the background around them? What is the context that is employed to make sense of this image? AI can't answer any of those questions in terms of context. And the same is true with services such as automatic generated captioning. That is something that's being very widely used now, but it's only appropriate in one-way communication. If there's additional distracting noises or whatnot, it is not effective. And oftentimes other people who are not relying on it for communication access believe that it's sufficient, but they don't realize that the burden that is placed on the individuals to filter out incorrect information. Individuals with disabilities use AI, we have it, we use it, but it can cause misunderstandings, especially in high stakes situations.
Yeah.
This is a huge problem that we're seeing. And this is an issue where we really need to fix AI such that everyone is aware of an appropriate and inappropriate way of using it. We can allow definitely people with disabilities to use AI as needed and also challenge AI to be as good as we can get it to be, as we can train it to be. Like, garbage in, garbage out is very appropriate in this situation. Many deaf and hard of hearing individuals may be able to speak and use their voices, but then AI is not able to understand that because of a lack of context, whereas a human can understand a person's speech dependent on context. So that makes it less useful for individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing or have other speech disabilities. So AI developers unintentionally, I hope, exclude many users because it would disrupt the model that they're trying to propose, right? And instead, we really need to be including people
Yeah.
with particularly speech disabilities in these models, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's sort of two different ways to approach the issue. We have this grant in hopes of really addressing the responsible use of AI by users and by developers.
Yeah, thank you for walking us through how to balance some of those issues. And I have a follow-up question for you, and then Bonnie and Marcy, I know you're also each working with AI already, and I want to bring that over to you. So Raja, and this may be a short question, but I noticed that in the past, like one of the things we were trying to do at OSTP was to start more discussion in the disability community about AI. And the US Access Board did this wonderful set of public hearings just to listen and see what the community was concerned about. But I'm now seeing many different pockets of discussion in different parts of the disability community about AI from every perspective. And then separately, I'm seeing these discussions in civil society and public interest technology groups and global groups on ethical and responsible AI. And magically, I'm not seeing people with disabilities who work on AI being invited into those settings very frequently. Um, do you think that's a problem? Do you think that that needs to be a more of an integrated discussion to make sure we don't get this all wrong?
Definitely. Circling back to inclusion on all levels, user and developer, and everywhere in between. This is the piece where our research, where we need to think about not being exclusionary. And this, of course, is tied to disasters as well. Like if we don't have access to information, if we don't have the communication that we need.
So Bonnie, Marcy, who wants to jump in next?
Go.
Bonnie, what are you doing on AI right now? And do you think the discussions are inclusive enough? And you're muted.
Sorry, this is Bonnie. Yeah, I first off, no, I don't think the discussions are inclusive enough. Absolutely not. I think the way you described it, Judy, are right. Is there's pockets of conversation, but we need to have these conversations. People with disability should be in all rooms where decisions are being made, and certainly that applies to AI. We're thinking a lot about that garbage in, garbage out part of things. We're very focused in thinking about the underlying data and the gaps in the data and what that's going to mean for potential bias and our ability to even know if bias is there. If we don't have the data and we can't collect the data, doesn't mean bias isn't happening. It just might mean we're not able to detect it.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I'm worrying about that too. Marcy, do you want to chime in on this?
Sure. This is Marcy speaking. And, I am largely excited about the possibilities of AI to continue to level playing fields for disabled people to have the same opportunities, or maybe even because of, some of our superpowers, maybe we can actually help other people to benefit from the kinds of accessibility that AI will make possible. And, at the World Institute on Disability, we are really excited about some opportunities we've had. One in particular is we have a global alliance for disaster resource acceleration that brings together disability-led organizations and donors providing humanitarian action. Because time and again, those resources don't make it to those local disability-led organizations. They kind of get scooped up by everybody else. So we are, thanks to Tech to the Rescue, we have been building a matching system that, gathers information about disasters and information about the needs of disaster impacted communities, and then drives the humanitarian actors and the disability leaders in those communities together. AI makes this so much more possible for us. We also have, as part of our work with Infinite Access, have developed a technology solution to hyper-personalize the emergency information that people receive, so that they can take personal protective measures, so they can make decisions for themselves, for their family, for their community, and really shifting the perception that people with disabilities are a liability in disasters, and really moving that paradigm to one in which we are the problem solvers, and
Yeah.
we have the skills and tools to support our communities.
It's been fascinating watching in the digital accessibility community, which again, I think has been a lot more integrated with regard to people with disabilities for decades now, that people with disabilities are recognized as a pool of innovators, partly because, getting through the day with a disability is a 24/7 exercise in problem solving. Raja, it looked like you had a comment you wanted to add on this, or... Yeah, okay. And actually just hang on just a sec, because I want to remind people who are attending this webinar that you have an opportunity to ask us questions. And we have one question so far on disaster stuff. Marcy, that one's going to go to you. We have another question that's come in on AI Summit. But if people have a burning question, feel free to write it in there, and then we'll switch modes in a minute or two. Raja, please follow up with your thought.
Thank you. I wanted to add that inclusive AI is now becoming universal AI, and
Yes.
we're seeing that people are developing for people with disabilities, but then that is useful to everyone. For example, image descriptions. Again, people are describing something through their phone and then adding a caption. We're seeing this kind of use all of the time. And also with disaster preparedness, lots of creative uses are available based on experiences of the disability community. And there's, I think, an interesting way to reframe how we're referring to it.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that those kinds of like universal benefits from working with technologists with disabilities start to emerge more in the national and global discussion. And I'm sorry, I have one more question on this topic, which is I'm curious if accessibility of those settings, of the mainstream ethical, responsible AI is part of the problem. Is that a barrier that makes it harder to get into those discussions? Because that's a very solvable thing, right? Nobody's going to answer unless I individually call on you. I'm getting a few nods. All right. So I have to say, we've got some great questions here. And one of them is from, let me see, from Jaquil, who's noting that Louisiana had its 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. We're still losing the context of disability, disaster preparedness, and support. In his state, at least, does there continue to be a large gap? And is that associated with lack of involvement from areas prone to more risk of disasters versus those without? So I was going to ask Marcy, but let me see. Dan, I'm just talking to my colleague in the background. I see a note from you there. I'm going to give this to Marcy, and let me know if I'm missing something in chat, Dan. Marcy, what do you think?
So,
What's your answer for Jaquil?
yeah, this is Marcy. And first of all, Jaquil, my friend, it's good to see you on here. And I would have sent you a note to say I see you, except I don't have that opportunity in the chat. But so glad you asked this question. And, I have to be painfully honest and say I am seeing a bigger and more growing gap in the United States, while at the same time, I see that gap closing in many, many other countries. This technology solution that I was talking about earlier, we had really hoped that we were going to be able to move much more quickly in the US. And it looks like the opportunities in other countries are unfolding in a much greater way. So, there is this perception that because the United States is not part of the global South, that we are somehow doing great when it comes to providing, closing the gaps in areas that are more at risk of disasters, but that's just not true. The US is experiencing some of the most devastating disasters in the world. The intensity, the frequency, and the impact is growing. And I do not see here in the US right now that this is being prioritized. And that worries me tremendously.
So we're getting a really good assortment of questions right now, which means that it's going to be very hard to select the questions. I'm going to go next to a brief question that came in from Brian Gran, because it's about a topic that I really want to mention with regard to AI, and that's privacy of personally identifiable information. And this is it's funny because as each emerging technology comes up, the privacy concerns among people with disabilities emerge as one of the top issues. And part of that is because when you have a small n, when you have a somewhat smaller population, especially a population with very distinct characteristics, it's much harder to de-identify the data safely, even sometimes when the researchers think that they can. And particularly if you have a super rare or ultra rare disability, you're up a creek when it comes to your personally identifiable data. So I wanted to just mention to Brian that I'm seeing a lot of different groups look at the privacy topic in AI One of the things I'm encouraged by, but I need to look at it more closely, is some work that Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web, is doing. And I talked with him recently about this. He has a book out about it because he's saying this is the next untackled problem yet on the web. The business model is owning our data, but we could use a mechanism such as this inrupt solid, INRUPT solid thing. So I want to look at that more because it might be something that might particularly help with regard to protecting disability data. There's a bunch more good questions. I'm sorry to jump in myself on that one. Should we take some of the other questions, or do either of you want to jump in quickly on this one as well? Raja?
Actually, I just typed my response in the question and answer box about in terms of personal identifying information for people with disabilities. Absolutely. We want to include people with disabilities without forcing disclosure. And I think there's a new approach in ways to make that happen. It's an important question for consideration. I don't think it's been resolved at all yet.
Yeah. And I'm actually excited to see some possible mechanisms to solve it. I'm again going to jump around a little bit.
Judy,
Yes,
this is
Dan,
Dan
hi.
speaking. We have a question here from the viewing room from one of the students. Is it okay
Okay.
to
Can
offer
you,
that question now?
Sure. And I think we're only going to be able to do two more questions. So why don't you tell the topic? And sorry, I forgot that you've got some people there in person. What's the topic, Dan?
No worries whatsoever. This topic is going to be about inclusive design of digital products.
Okay,
Do you
go
want me to read it out
ahead.
now?
Just do it, yeah, a brief, and then I'll see who among our panelists is dying to jump on that question. And it might be Raja. Yeah, okay, great.
No, I
So,
think, oh, sorry, this is Raja signing. Yes, I think that relates to what I've already spoken to before. We have to have people with disabilities involved in both the development space and in the user space. And there's just no shortcut around that. And that is what we want to raise awareness on in education programs and internships and in the industry as well, and making sure that this is really happening. That it's becoming a common practice, right? When we see like with certification processes, for example.
okay, thank you, Raja. Dan, can you confirm that that response got somewhere close to the student in the room that you're with?
Yeah, this was perfect. Thank you so much. And by the
Okay,
way, just
great.
so you know, the question was from Sarah Algashgari.
Thank you. Okay, great. So I want to mention another question that came in from Colette and it's with regard to teaching. And I wanted to just give a tiny little answer and then see if Bonnie or Raja or Marthy want to chime in on that. With regard to teaching these topics, I looked at the trajectory of digital accessibility, and they finally realized that the schools weren't teaching enough. And so they put this wonderful collection, and thank you to Larry Goldberg and Kate Sonka for all the work that you have at Teach Access. But there's this massive repository of largely free supplemental instruction material. Would some of that be useful in public policy education as well, or do we need to add more pieces to their repository? Bonnie, you're nodding. Do you want to say anything?
Yeah, sure. This is Bonnie. Yeah, I firmly believe that lessons of accessibility have to be across all curriculum, right? Not just technology, not just policy, but everything. And that the challenge there is to what you're alluding to, is both developing the curriculum and training the trainer, right? This would be a bit of a disruption in how our current faculty and teaching staff would do things. I don't know that we've got enough of a ready to go workforce to train that next generation. So I think you're right. We've got to create some more materials that span a broader range of fields and sectors and courses.
Okay, thank you. Marcy, half a minute.
Half a minute. It seems to me that we are missing out on the opportunity to do, as we've often heard, the most important things I learned in kindergarten.
Yeah,
We need to be teaching young children about accessibility. We need to be teaching young children about accessibility in coding. We need to make this such an obvious part of everyday life that by the time they get to careers, it's already solidly baked in.
I totally agree. We're going to be losing one of our interpreters in just a moment. We need to do a hard stop to the meeting. I saw a lot of other great questions there. I'm going to say to Sylvia at Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund with your question, yes, we need to take some of this to states. Thank you for all you're doing at DREDIF to help defend the baseline of a lot of the disability rights and programs. I'm so I was so happy that Bonnie and Raja and Marcy said yes when I reached out to them to invite them to be panelists here, because I know that this is a passion for each of you, and I wanted to bring that to a larger group. I want to thank the UC Berkeley School of Information and Goldman School of Public Policy again, and Deirdre Mulligan for starting this executive fellowship program in applied technology policy. She's awesome. And I also want to thank the ASL interpreters who have helped us today, and the CART reporter. And I really want to thank the participants who joined us today. I can tell from the questions, there's a lot of people starting to think about this in different ways. And there is so much that could be done on this topic, and it would be so wonderful if people coming into policymaking settings, we're aware that there's a lot of people with different kinds of policy needs, and there's a lot of technologies that helps us participate in the world. And sometimes there's a connection between the tech and the policy. Dan and Vivian, also, thank you so much for your help in this. So I think that's it. We plan to have a recording available. Thank you all for joining us today. Take care.